The Israelis will now forever be known as the group that inflicted a Holocaust on these poor, trapped people next to them. And I can't believe more of them aren't standing up against it just for their own self-interest.
So Dave Smith was recently interviewed by Piers Morgan concerning the situation in Gaza, the situation in Syria, Israel in general, and what Benjamin Netanyahu's legacy will ultimately be. Few people have studied these issues as closely as Dave, so I can't wait to get his insights. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
I mean, you could look back in the whole century at regime change, you know, in Libya, in Iraq, everywhere. And incredibly unpalatable though it may seem, it's very rarely can you point to any of it that's ever actually worked, you know, for the reasons we may now be seeing in Syria. It all sounds good, but actually, where's it worked?
Well, I mean, look, the examples that people would point to would be Germany and Japan as historically, and look, to be completely fair here to the other side, I mean, those are pretty remarkable examples. I remember I read Henry Kissinger's book, World Order, which, by the way, try reading a Henry Kissinger book without hearing it in Henry Kissinger's voice in your mind. It's an impossible challenge. But he says in the opening of the book, he says that the greatest US president ever was Truman. And now, while I disagree with his assessment on this, but you could see from Kissinger's point of view, he goes, look, the greatest achievement ever by an American president was to defeat Germany and Japan and then bring them back into the world order. And however you feel about that, that is a pretty remarkable achievement. But let's not kid ourselves. What did it take in order to do that?
But also, let me.
Yeah, absolutely. That is true. And they were success stories to some extent, but a lot of that has been done, and yet so many forces, U.S. forces, still remain in places like Germany and Japan, and it doesn't really make sense outside of empire building strategies to have so many troops in those regions. It's basically a permanent, permanent stable for the U.S. empire to remain there. And there's been so many more counterexamples, of course. So Dave is actually giving this a very charitable reading when discussing those two countries. But, we never talk about the regime change failures in Iran. I mean, that came up in some dissident circles before what just went down there. Places like Guatemala, places like Afghanistan, where they replaced the Taliban with the Taliban after 20 years and hundreds of thousands of deaths and hundreds of billions of dollars. That's the result there. Iraq, 20-year regime change operation and occupation to follow, spending billions of dollars there, killing about 1 billion people. And then there's Iranian fundamentalists in control of that country now. I should say Shiite extremists there. The situations are just endless here. You can go to Libya and say, hey, Gaddafi was deposed and now his weapons are scattered over sub-Saharan Africa, and there's open slave trading there right now. So yeah, mostly it's been disastrous. Japan and Germany are the exceptions. Those both happened about 80 years ago, and the U.S. still maintains troops there despite the fact that we don't need to.
Let me rephrase my statement. I wasn't talking that far back in history. I'm talking about since the Arab Spring and all the uprisings there. Because I've been on CNN for like a month when that was going on, and I just remember it all. I remember everyone feeling like, well, this is going to be great for all these countries.
Yes.
And actually,
people got swept up in it.
And the hard reality is that it sounds great, but the reality often is it just creates mayhem.
Yes. But so anyway, the point I was making is that you have to go that far back into history. We had to go to total war against the civilian population and take innocent civilian life in staggering numbers like we have never happened before in the history of the world. But also, you'd even have to ignore the precursor to World War II, which was World War I, when Woodrow Wilson said, we're going to make the world safe for democracy. And the world certainly wasn't safe for democracy at the time. It was monarchs who ruled all of Europe. But when those monarchs were overthrown, what rose up was Lenin and Stalin and Adolf Hitler. And so even before those examples, we should have gone in knowing that regime change is a very risky game. And of course, to your point, the entire run of regime changes post 9/11 and those, starting before the Arab Spring, but through it and after it, every last one of them has been a catastrophe.
Absolutely, and there's no better example of regime change being a failure than the rise of the Bolsheviks and, the Russian revolutions, two of which occurred in 1917. You had Germany complicit with sending Lenin to Russia, believing that that would destabilize Russia. It did to an extent, but it sure seems to have bit them in the ass to some extent too. And, they were still paying the price for that into the 1990s. Some people think they're still paying the price. Also, regime operations and regime change operations that are much more relevant and germane to what is bearing out right now in a negative way is the U.S. regime change in Ukraine in 2014, when the U.S. backed a coup, the Maidan coup, that dislodged the democratically elected president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, and had him replaced with a provisional government and ultimately a president of Russia that was bellicose toward, or the president of Ukraine that was bellicose toward Russia. And we're still paying for that because they got involved in a quasi-civil war in 2014 forward. Putin invaded Ukraine in like the 7th year of that war, and the U.S. has still bankrolled the antagonism there with a nuclear power, when relations with Russia were actually not too bad until the U.S. got involved in Syria. So that's another issue, but that's what is panned out there.
And so this is one of the things I was warning about a few weeks back when Donald Trump was talking about regime change, and a lot of the war hawks were advocating for it in Iran. And they're trying to convince you, Pierce, that the son of the Shah is going to walk in and take over, and it's going to be liberal 70s Iran again. But there's simply no guarantee of that. And much like we're seeing now in Syria, we saw in Libya, we saw in Egypt, we saw in Yemen, we saw in Afghanistan, and we saw in Iraq. And these regime changes led to a far worse catastrophe than we had before them.
Do you think there should be regime change in Israel?
Well, I mean, I certainly wouldn't advocate a regime change war there because I've all the points I just made, and I've seen how that worked. But in terms of there's lots of countries in the world I'd like to see the regime change. I'd love to see a regime change in North Korea and in Iran too, just not one that was imposed by outside force. And so certainly
I meant a kind of organic.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. This is the right answer here. I would like to see many governments displaced and maybe alternatives take their place, but none of it should be financed by the U.S., supported by the U.S., orchestrated in a military empire building like scheme. So yeah, I'm totally with Dave here.
I think one where Netanyahu's been delaying having an election. If there was an election, it just seems completely baffling to me that a majority of Israelis, and the polls suggest this is not the case, that they're not utterly repulsed by what is being done in their name now in Gaza. You could easily construct, as I have done, a defense of what the Israeli government did to dismantle Hezbollah. Incredibly surgical, extremely successful from a military perspective, very little civilian casualties. You could just say that was an exemplar attack against a terror group, which was very successful. Similarly, I would defend their right to do what they did in Iran. I think you feel differently, but other people, take sides either way. But again, it was pretty surgical. There wasn't much civilian loss of life as it went on. It clearly did have a big dismantling effect on a lot of Iran's ability, perhaps, to progress to nuclear weapons. So you can see
that's totally bogus. It's very true, and lots of indications that they were able to get a lot of the enriched uranium out of Fordo. And if you're a Russian enthusiast, if you're a Russian zealot, if you're close to the government, why wouldn't you now, unlike before, decide to fast track a nuke? There's more incentive that they have to do that now than ever, because they've been bullied by the biggest bullies on the block in the form of the U.S. and Israel. Maybe this delayed them to some extent, but the political impulses would now drive them to acquiring a nuke. And just to correct Pierce on one thing he said earlier was that Benjamin Netanyahu is delaying elections. In a way, that's true, but he's actually not obligated to have an election in Israel until October of 2026. And there are some indications that an election could happen before that. If his coalition crumbles or something like that, that is possible. But I think he's as popular as ever within the right-wing circles of Israel. Certainly, there are critics in Israel that have criticized him, and you see this playing out in Israeli media. But just wanted to make that clear for the record.
The logic here. But I see no logic whatsoever for this indiscriminate carnage now in Gaza, or where it's leading, other than exactly where Smodrich said 4 weeks ago it was leading, which is the expulsion of all Palestinians, which would be just a clear example of a ethnic cleansing war crime.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. And look, I mean, we may disagree a little bit about the Iranian situation, but there's no question, right? The one in Gaza is the one that's just totally indefensible. I mean, when you think about it, it was, well, if I do my math right here, it was 19 months ago that South Africa brought their genocide case to the International Court of Justice, and the court ruled that it was plausibly a genocide then. And now, almost over a year and a half later, we're sitting here and the IDF is shooting at starving people as they're desperately trying to get a tiny bit of food. They're setting up a concentration camp and they're openly talking about ethnic cleansing. They can call it relocation or transfer, but this is just pathetic euphemisms at this point.
Yeah.
And so to be this a year and a half plus after they were credibly accused of genocide, I mean, this is indefensible. And I completely agree with you, Piers. It's shocking that the Israeli people, who I do not, through all this time, I have never once condemned the people of Israel. I always keep it to their government and the neoconservatives and the war hawks. But I am shocked because there are good people in Israel, and it's shocking that they're not like morally appalled by this, particularly given the history that us Jews have and how connected to that so many Jewish people are, that they'd be on the other side of this.
Yeah, some of them are. There are Israeli dissidents, if you can believe it. Of course, their names never get into the headlines, not only in the United States, but in many times in Israel. But there are oppositional, even media pieces. Haaretz is certainly not the biggest fan of Netanyahu. But yeah, Dave is right. And whether you want to call this a genocide or not, I know a lot of people are like, oh, I'm rolling my eyes when you call it genocide. I think we're so far beyond that. The real point in bringing this up is that it doesn't make sense for the U.S. to continue financing Israel under these conditions and even financing its Iron Dome. I mean, you even had people like AOC that voted against an amendment that would restrict funding for the Iron Dome. And by funding the Iron Dome, you give Israel the wherewithal to fund all of its offensive and genocidal operations, including in Gaza, including in Iran, etc. So why would we be dumping in money to Israel regardless? The U.S. shouldn't be involved. And yeah, I think there's a very good case for it being a genocide, but I think it's also a red herring to just focus on that. Why not just focus on the policy? The U.S. shouldn't be involved. And yeah, international opinion has turned wildly against Israel, and I'm glad for that. But I don't hinge my desire to dislodge my country from Israel on international opinion on this or any other issue. It's my earnest desire for America first, for localism, to make America the centerpiece. We're in debt. We're suffering through inflation while dumping money into Benjamin Netanyahu's hands. He's a war criminal.
Of this genocide. But then on top of that, I'm almost more baffled by their own instincts for self-preservation, that they don't simply read the room and go, we cannot get away with this. Even if we can get away with this politically in the moment, which they might be able to, they have turned global opinion against them, particularly with the younger generation, in a way that simply will never be reversed. Their only course to reverse that would be that organic regime change that me and you were just talking about, would be for the Israeli people to stand up and say, hey, we've had enough, and we simply will not support our government as they do this. And the fact that they don't see the writing on the walls, there's that line from the Simon and Garfunkel song where they say, how does it go? The words of the prophets are written on the subway walls and tenement halls. There's, look at that, Pierce. You're probably more connected to like the internet culture and the signals of the new media than anybody else. Look at the writing on the walls all around you. Israel will never be thought of the way that people in your generation and my generation thought of this when we were young.
Yeah, I think this is totally correct. If you look at posterity and them looking back at the situation will think, I think it's very, very, very likely that they will look upon this as a total catastrophe. Why was the U.S. involved in this? Netanyahu is a supervillain. How could you get away with funding this? It might be looked at the way that, our generations look back at slavery. How could anyone support this wretched type of system? And that is what this is. This is a wretched system of empire building in the Middle East, always taking Israel's side. And again, I cite my disdain for this policy on inward desires, on the fact that it's unfeasible and immoral for Americans to support this. But he's right about international opinion. And, I think it would take defectors from the inside, from Netanyahu's coalition, to get away from this thing and start to, lose focus and desire to continue these policies that might end it, if not for, additional wars. I don't see an end to this in the near time, especially because Trump doesn't seem to be willing to end it. In fact, he seems willing to let Netanyahu greenlight violations of ceasefires in Gaza that he orchestrated, including the one which he indeed engineered as he stepped into the Oval Office for his second term.
The victims of the Holocaust who went and set up their own state for their own independence. The Israelis will now forever be known as the group that inflicted a Holocaust on these poor, trapped people next to them. And I can't believe more of them aren't standing up against it just for their own self-interest.
Man, he said it. I mean, amen. That's right on point, and I think that that's likely to prove true. I haven't seen any, kind of evidence to suggest the contrary, that's for sure.
No, and what concerns me is what Israeli people may be hearing and seeing on their media. It's a bit like in Russia. I'm told by people in Russia, it's just a constant diet of extremely pro-Russian propaganda gets pumped out morning, noon, and night. And that's really what the people hear. And I wonder whether there's a very insular thing going on in Israel with the media too, where it's very difficult.
Bless your heart, Pierce. This happens in every country. This happens in every country where regime propaganda, especially as it accords and is associated with war, transpires. They know that the people aren't innately willing to support wars, especially when there's problems in their domestic life in terms of domestic policy, that they have to create war propaganda to sell this. That's not unique to the United States, though our war propaganda is probably the most sophisticated and most successful. There's no country that started more wars in my lifetime than the United States, but this happens everywhere. So of course that's true in Israel too.
If you're not minded to do it, to actively go and seek it, to hear or see anything different on your local Israeli media. I've heard it's incredibly one-sided and relentless.
I'm sure there's some truth to that, but I got to say, I could prosecute an entire case against the Israeli government just using Haaretz and the Times of Israel and the Jerusalem Post.
That's true,
So it's not like they don't have access to this information.
Yeah.
That piece, I believe it was titled "A Killing Field" in Haaretz last month, where they got IDF soldiers on the record admitting that they were given, or at least one on the record and a bunch off the record, admitting that they were given orders to shoot at the people desperately trying to get food. And the Israeli government denied the orders were given, and they disputed the number, but they didn't dispute that it was IDF shooting at them. No. So that excuse, I don't think the Israeli people have that excuse anymore. They also have the internet there, which I don't think is exactly the same as the Russian situation. So they're, I don't know. I'd like to give them an excuse, but I think they do have access to this information.
Yeah, certainly so. Like Dave said, Haaretz, Times of Israel at Times, Jerusalem at Post, they do post articles that aren't exactly kind to the decisions of Netanyahu all the time. And the truth is that the media was on his case. The overwhelming Israeli media was on his tails, condemning him, denouncing him for these corruption and fraud charges that took place shortly before October 7th. October 7th, in many ways, saved the career of Benjamin Netanyahu. And Dave is right, there are some dissident voices, but it's being lost in war fervor and genocide fervor in this case, where, hey, they just get to justify what's happening in Gaza over October 7th and constantly just blame it on Hamas and bring up the human shields argument that would never fly in any other place than Israel. I'm sorry, that would not fly in the United States, where you get to level, the city a size of Rafah. It's hard for me to consider a comparison there. Let's say, theoretically, Tallahassee is the size of Rafah. I don't know that that's true. You wouldn't be able to get away with, destroying 75% of the buildings in Tallahassee if some human shields, supposedly human shields were taken into some buildings there. You wouldn't be able to just be like, all right, we'll drop the bombs, let our children die as hostages there because, you invoke the human shields argument, you win. And by the way, you know, this would be akin also to saying, like, anyone skeptical of dropping those bombs on Tallahassee, wiping them out, destroying 75% of the buildings, you know, you're just sympathizing with the criminals that took the hostages. That's exactly what would happen here. So Dave's done an incredibly good job of taking one moral standard when it comes to war and applying it to all sides. And he seems to discuss foreign policy in relation to the countries that take the most money from the American taxpayer. That's America first. That's really America only. It's Ukraine and Israel that is taking the lion's share of my money. Now, if the situation was different and Russia demanded, you know, $200 billion in taxpayer money to fund their invasion of Ukraine, I would have the same reservations. I don't want to get wrapped up in any wars like this, any proxy wars, any regime change operations, any military strikes with specious reasons for launching them, like the recent war in Iran. And there's just no sense in continuing to fund Netanyahu when there's so much vile behavior on his part. And just the idea that we're just going to keep doing this as he undermined the foreign policy goal of normalizing relations with Iran, that was shelved. There was negotiations on the table that could have led to a new JCPOA that would actually have curtailed their potential to enrich uranium and acquire a nuclear weapon, just as it had in 2015 to 2018 before Trump shredded that. It's really the only good foreign policy expedient that Obama ever made, if you ask me. I think Obama was a disaster in foreign policy in terms of Syria and Libya and the drone war in the Arabian Peninsula, but that was actually pretty good. You know, that kept us, you know, away from regime change being on the table in Iran, and that's gone now. And Netanyahu is one of the big reasons that's gone. He saw these negotiations play out, and I think he selectively used the timing of that to take that pretext for regime change off the table and get the U.S. involved. And that hasn't gone away either. So, yeah, I'm largely with Dave here. He's brought up some really interesting topics and actually was pretty charitable when it comes to regime change, and which are really the only two successful ones. It was a great point that he made earlier that you have to go back, 80, 70 years to see the actual success stories. The success stories of regime change aren't in modern times, and they aren't in pro-Western countries or countries that would be inclined to be pro-Western. They're in countries that are likely to be a hotbed and a power vacuum, as has proven out in Libya and Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan. That's what we've learned. And those aren't the exceptions to the rule. Japan and Germany are the exceptions to the rule, and they happened, 80 to 70 years ago. So that's where we're at. Let me know in the comments below. Do you agree with Dave on this? Is he right about regime change? Is he right about Netanyahu's legacy? How this will go down to posterity? Let me know down below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Piers Morgan too. He does great interviews with people like Dave. And please consider becoming a YouTube member by clicking the join button below. You can support this channel, which would be greatly appreciated by me. I would bow to you if you go to those links, but I'll also in return give you the ability to access all of my videos before they go live on YouTube in return. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.